Good morning, everyone. This session is going to be about what do human rights and the Hyogo Framework have in common. My colleague is just distributing some information about our activities, so any interested, please ask him. The objectives of my presentation are going to be threefold. Links between HFA and human rights in terms of the issues that we deal with. The links between HFA and the human rights legal framework and process. And finally, the added value of the human rights legal framework to promote the implementation of HFA. First of all, the basic link between HFA and human rights. As you can see on the screen, you've got two columns. The first, the basic DRR issues, and the respective human rights issues on the right. On the left, basically destruction of livelihood, lack of food. Of course, there is a right to food. Cholera, other illnesses, there is an adequate right to health. Destruction of houses, shelter, forced migration, there is a right to housing. Destruction of workplace, there is a right to work. Information about risks, there's a right to information, right to education. So we already see that there is some connections, and in other forums, namely the human rights forums, there have been discussions about the content of all these issues. The links now between HFA and the human rights framework, objectives and process. If we look again at this page, we see on the left column the HFA priorities. I took those who were most relevant to keep it very short. And on the right column, the human rights framework. So we already see as the first one, the first priority, ensure that disaster risk reduction is a national and local priority, with a strong institutional basis for implementation. For us, when we look from a human rights perspective, we know that states already listed in international human rights law all the issues which needed to be dealt with as a matter of priority. And this includes in particular obligations to respect. These obligations to respect can integrate DRR components. So it is really in the realm of the states to acknowledge and promote these issues conjointly. P3, use of knowledge, innovation and education to build a culture of safety and resilience at all levels. In all the conferences here, we have heard about the importance of having community participation, access to information. States already committed in the human rights framework to empower the local population, and in particular what we call procedural guarantees, namely access to information, participation, and effective accountability mechanisms. P4, reduce the underlying risk factors, establish in particular mechanisms for protecting the poor and the more vulnerable. This is something that could have been taken from any human rights resolution. States already committed in the human rights framework to focus on poor and vulnerable and develop appropriate accountability mechanisms. So you already see the overlaps between these two frameworks. For us at Waterlex, this is really what we try to promote, looking at what has been developed in other frameworks and see how it can contribute to a more effective implementation of the DRR, the major DRR framework. So the added value of international human rights law to promote the implementation of HFA. Here is a four-step process, very basically, about the implementation process of human rights standards. The first step, notifying all affected ministries of the impact of a relevant human right. For example, the right to water. When I do, for example, country evaluations for relevant governments, I find that there are issues around the Ministry of Environment, Public Works, Health, Emergency, Education, or the Ministry of Justice. How often do I find that governments don't have a coordinating body? How often do I find that there is a lack of coordination? There is an obligation of coordination among ministries, and this is driven by what? A legal commitment, namely to ensure the consistency of national laws, strategies, and policies. So law binds the governments, and this is the interesting dimension of ensuring that the DRR framework links with legal commitments. So, third step, developing new institutions to give effect to procedural guarantees of human rights. The big danger when we talk about human rights is to leave them high in the air and forgetting that there are key conditions to ensure their realization. And among these is simply basic access to information, participation in negotiations over budget allocation, which is a new trend, effective complaint mechanisms as the third one. And once we reach these three steps, now it is highly relevant to empower local populations. If you don't have effective institutions, empowerment of local populations won't lead to a positive effect. But if you have these three stages, local populations will be able to know which institutions they can interact with, which institutions they can exchange with to improve resilience to disaster risk. Now, the second added value, I just presented what happens at the national level. At the international level, within the UN Human Rights Council, there is the added value of having a peer review. This is a political body. Other governments will look at the way each government is implementing its human rights obligations. And it is highly interesting to hear the comments and having an official setting in which NGOs with technical specialization can exchange and dialogue with governments on the way they set the budget allocations, on the way they decided to set the priorities, on the way they are exchanged with the local and most vulnerable groups. And further, and it goes even beyond, it is about the individual complaint mechanism. I'm giving an example from a regional mechanism in the Americas, which covers Latin America and Northern America. We have here the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Every individual living in one of those countries may send a complaint to this body. And this happens with many international human rights conventions, UN conventions. And the possibility then is for this body, these commissioners, to undertake field missions, discuss with all the actors, all the stakeholders, governments, private sector, local population, about how the government decided to implement its obligations. And all this facilitation and interaction generates much more effect on the ground. So my conclusion, is there a need for real commitment, including the financial one, and accountability in the DRR sector? This question, of course, I know my answer, but I would like to send this message that actually in the human rights environment, financial contributions, cooperation is not a matter of charity. In a human rights framework, it is an international obligation. Is it an opportunity to link to the human rights framework? The content I just mentioned, the objectives, and the added value are, in my opinion, something that promotes this idea. However, the four main issues why I personally see an added value are the question of adequate evaluation of risk for the local population, the obligation of community involvement, the justification for budget expenditures, which is a high, very strong trend now in the human rights framework, and finally, the target setting. A last quotation from Kofi Annan before I turn the floor to you and your questions. There will be no development without security, and no security without development. And both development and security also depend on respect for human rights and the rule of law. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Are there any questions? No questions? Please.
Hello, I'm Janet from Costa Rica, and I would like to know if you have some experience in Central America. Can you explain me, please, about your job? Yes. I mean, to implement water leaks in Costa Rica and human rights and disasters.
So we didn't work specifically in Costa Rica. We have very good contacts with the current ambassador, who is a passionate advocate of the right to water and sanitation. So I don't know if you're from the delegation, but this is definitely
I'm
okay.
from.
Yeah. So, but in Latin America, we've been engaging in Paraguay. So basically, our work was to put in relation the budget allocation of the Ministry of Emergencies with the Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Public Works, Ministry of Health, and engaging a dialogue. In many countries, you will find that the ministries, and I'm not speaking now specifically about Paraguay, but when you have a coalition government, you have at the head of the ministries different parties or people defending different parties. And so it is highly difficult to motivate ministers to work jointly on a joint thematic issue. So if you have a third party coming in and arguing not on the basis of political will, but as a matter of legal compliance and pushing for coordination using a set of principles to be respected by any party in order to set the right priorities, it is we found that there is a very interesting feedback from it escapes, let's say, the political division, and it generates quite interesting processes, as we are currently having in Paraguay.
Thank you so much.
Any question? No? Well, in each case, I thank you very much.